Good evening, folks, and welcome back to That Way. I'm your host, Anthony Downer, and I'm excited tonight to, of course, continue our conversations about education liberation. Of course, to celebrate all things Women's History Month. Yesterday, of course, we celebrated International Women's Day. And then to bring on a special guest who can provide a different perspective, a refined perspective, if you will, on what's going on in education from his home state of North Carolina. And so, of course, like I said, I want to celebrate Women's History Month. We're live on Instagram. Shout out to our folks on Instagram. We're live on Facebook tonight. We're live on YouTube. Thank you so much for joining us once again for these joyful and important conversations. We're going to continue to bring you great guests, whether they be students, activists, community members, educational leaders, and we're so excited to center the criticality, the intellectualism, and the joy that our public school system is lacking. Song of the night, you heard a little bit of it, is UNITY, Unity by Queen Latifah. You know, I was just watching some old episodes of Living Single, which was a little bit before my time. I'm born in 1994. I guess the show came out, 92, 1, 2, 3. Forgive me if I don't know the year. But it's on Hulu, so I was watching some old episodes. Wow. It's crazy to see the ways in which the world has changed, crazy to see ways in which the world has not changed. But regardless, we're using this space to talk about all things blackity black. Of course, one of the things we're talking about are the continued attacks and violence against Black education, Black learners, Black students, Black teachers, and education leaders, with a lot of these anti-CRT or classroom censorship bills coming out of states like Georgia and North Carolina. As we celebrate Black women in this space during during Women's History Month and a continuation of Black History Month, today I want to share what happened in the history. In 1892, Ida B. Wells's friends Thomas Moss, Calvin McDowell, and Henry Stewart were lynched in Memphis, Tennessee, inspiring her lifelong passion, her fight against lynching. She, of course, was also active in the suffrage movement, pushing for women's right to vote. And of course, we know that a lot of Black women pushed for that right, that was enjoyed by white women, even though Black women couldn't vote securely until the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And so today we honor Black women from Queen Latifah to Ida B. Wells and so many more. And of course, we'll keep that going all episode long with centering those voices. And so, without further ado, we have a lot to talk about. So, I want to go ahead and bring on my guest, the Dr. Stephen Bond from North Carolina. Come on, Dr. Bond. I'm so excited to have this conversation with you and talk about across state lines what's going on, and also share some of the similarities of how we use the classroom to do this thing that we love to do called teaching. So go ahead and introduce yourself a little bit, and then let's get started talking about your book. Dr. Bond, how are you today?
I'm doing great. How you doing?
I'm doing very well, Dr. Bond. And Dr. Bond, this year is what year for you teaching?
Year 22.
22. Almost
Yes.
my entire life.
I'd have laughed when you were talking about living single in 1994. I'm thinking I was a sophomore in college in 1994, so I'm showing my age a little bit there.
Yeah, it's a really cool show. But yeah, I'm sorry to all our viewers. I'm not trying to offend anybody, but I'm glad we can have this conversation, not just across state lines, but also generation lines as well. Let's go ahead and dig into it. So I've been enjoying this amazing book. I want to show everybody this book on Instagram, on YouTube, everywhere we're going, that Dr. Bond wrote and published during the pandemic. And what I love about it is it does exactly what we try to do as educators, is center the student voice. Allow the students, not speak for the student, not advocate for the student, but allow them to take the mic, take the bullhorn, and use their words to tell their stories. And this book, of course, it allows students to reflect on two big events, historical events that we're going to be teaching as history teachers one day, two historical events The pandemic, I know you all remember that fateful day in March for Georgia. It was Friday, March 13th, when we got the call, when we made the decision. And it was around that time for a lot of school districts. And then, of course, the killing of George Floyd, which, if you're in Georgia, was also added with Ahmaud Arbery. If you're in Kentucky, then that added on with Breonna Taylor and many, many other names again throughout that year. Even with the protests of that summer, we look at Rayshard Brooks, who was killed in the summer of 2020 as well. And so, with all that said, that social unrest, the political climate, it was an election year, it was a pandemic. 2020 was a mess. And to get our students to create their own primary sources on that time period is phenomenal. So, talk to us a little bit about this book. First question: which is your favorite? You don't have to choose one, but what's your favorite journal and why?
You know what? I have to say it's a tie because some students may be listening to this one day. There was two, yeah, there was two that really were dear to my heart. All of them were, but there was one by a girl named Lauren McCoy,
Hmm.
and Lauren McCoy is a sweet kid. She graduated high school 2 years ago, and she mentioned about how during the pandemic her mother worked in the hospital, and so even in fact like she couldn't even hug her mother when she got home because the risk that she might get sick. And so all the precautions she had to be covered up, completely while she at work, even when she got home. And that was dear to my heart. She mentioned how, there would be no prom, no field trip, no dating, no just the social aspects and how it hurt her. And it was a big deal for her. And I remember that same year we did have a graduation and it was like a drive to graduation. And, Lauren was a sweet young lady. I remember when after announcement done her when I graduated, she was to the point she hugged a few of her teachers. And it was to the point because she got so used to that where, as educators and students, you hug the person afterward for graduation because you don't know you're going to see them again.
Yeah.
And so that was dear to my heart. And also there was another one from a young man named Nasir Blackston. And he's a young man, he's at St. Augustine College in North Carolina now. He's a freshman basketball player. And he wrote an essay about George Floyd and how it affected him because what I did when I had these students write these journals, I want their opinion. I didn't want my own.
Yeah.
Black, white, Hispanic, whatever. I want their opinion, their view. And so, because when the pandemic started, a couple months later, was a George Floyd murder and it paralleled. And so people saw it on TV because people were home and they saw someone die in the hands of police officers on a knee, 9 minutes, 29 seconds, whatever time it was. And so he met y'all a couple of times that summer before where he was falsely accused and put in handcuffs just being in the wrong place, wrong time in Wilson, North Carolina. And so when he wrote that, I was like, wow, I didn't know. And so let you know that the thing with George Floyd could have happened to any young person. And here he mentioned a couple of times where because he was at the store and because he's 6'5" and looked the part supposedly that he was pulled over and put in handcuffs not once but twice that summer. So I give you perspective of how the racial issue just permeated through our country. But the difference was this time was one, people watching more, and secondly, if it was video recorded, what would have happened?
Yeah.
Yes, when the trial occurred, he was guilty, but because it was recorded, because it was taped, and people watching, there was so much evidence. But how many times in the past, and even now there have been cases like we mentioned Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, where innocent black people were killed because supposedly they looked the part or whatever. And so this time was one of the times where the whole world saw and officer was guilty. But often, many times, young black men go through that when they're driving and police following them, and they could be doing nothing wrong, but just perception. And so his journal resonated with me as well because I've been in that situation too, where been profiled just because of who you are. And so those two journals really stuck to my heart. Does it too? Just in case
Yeah.
anyone else is watching, but I'm just proud of the work that they did do because
Absolutely.
we talk about social emotional learning. Here, the students tell you how they felt about COVID, how it traumatized them, how it took away from their social lives and norms, and also how upset they were that a young man who's a father and devoted man was murdered in front of people.
Yeah. And I'm so glad you brought up the benefits of journaling and that it positively impacts their social emotional learning. It allows them to release some of that anxiety and that stress, to really process what's going on beyond their control. You know, these are big issues, and I can only imagine having to go through that pandemic and all these factors outside of your control as a 13, 14, 15, 16 year old, and how frustrated you must feel. You know, the mask mandates have ended in the state of Georgia for the most part, outside of transportation, and our schools were mask optional. Personally, I'm still trying to figure out my comfort level with that, but I can see
Mhm.
the joy that it's bringing the students to be able to see each other's faces, to be able to socialize, just to be able to be back in the building, and to see their faces, to see their smiles for the first time. It is something special. There's of course the health and science argument, and I get that, and I agree with it. There's also the human side of it, and a lot of our students have been missing that. And when we're talking about students, I teach on the west side of Atlanta. When we're talking about students who grew up in the hood, who already grew up under these really violent circumstances, really, um, uh, again, a lot of circumstances out of their control. Uh, this pandemic was the cherry on top, right? And so, of course, we
Mhm.
had a lot of students who might have struggled in their lives for the first time. This was just another piece of crap in the toilet of these students.
Mhm.
That's really hard to think about, because as they're coming in, we're seeing a lot of that built up anxiety and angst from the pandemic, plus years and years and generations before. So for you to do this is something powerful. Tell me, you ended. One thing that I really love is that you end on a high note. That you end with, you continue the book with motivational quotes and activities. There's a crossword.
Mhm.
I haven't got to the crossword yet. Where there's the word searches in it, y'all.
Mhm.
You could do this in your free time. How did you choose those motivational quotes?
Well, I'm big with quotes, and I believe words are powerful. And so when I thought about the quotes, I thought about people, leaders who I like. One of the people I definitely went on was Shirley Chisholm, because she's one of the unsung and not just women's history, but history in general. And years ago, my mother met her when she was in Brooklyn. My mom would say, "Yeah, I met Shirley Chisholm years ago." I was like, "Wow, that must have been exciting." So she's one of the people I wanted. Also, a lot of athletes, like I love Kobe Bryant, the Mamba mentality and just his quotes. And so I chose leaders from different genres. Not, yes, Martin Luther King, but also leaders who you don't always hear about, on a daily basis. Unfortunately, you don't always hear about the women from Hidden Figures. You don't always hear about Shirley Chisholm. You only hear about Eleanor Roosevelt and how she did a lot of the executive duties when Franklin Roosevelt, president, couldn't because he was sick. And so I chose a lot of people for quotes that you may not hear on a daily basis. And I wanted to really bring them out in the spotlight. So if you read the book, you say, wow, I like to know a little bit more about him, or I like to know a little bit about her. Everyone knows about LeBron James, but what about the quotes that he had? What about the fact he started a charter school for kids? These are things that they don't talk about much. Sometimes we see these athletes and think they're just athletes, but they also love the community. They do things for the community, have built schools and do activities and do fundraisers and donate. And so I wanted that to be, in the forefront as well. And I think the quotes and the people I chose in there show that for other people to see.
I would concur, absolutely. And so let's make the connection. These students, you have them talking about race. You have them talking about white supremacy. You have them talking about their experiences, all across the board. And it doesn't seem like I've watched your TikToks. I've read your book. It doesn't seem like you're shying away from the controversial and divisive topics. It seems like you're embracing them and showing your students how to grapple with them, how to express themselves, how to interact with different. It looks like you have students of different cultures and backgrounds and identities who are coming together to do this wonderful thing that we call learning. And these are the things that our legislators are trying to ban. In Georgia, on Friday, the House just passed one of their major classroom censorship bills, which bans divisive topics, which they define as saying things like the United States is systemically and foundationally racist, or that meritocracy is unfair and racist, or that intersectionality, that people have these different identities that might impact levels of privilege and oppression. They're trying to ban these things that we're talking about in our classrooms, especially in social studies. What are your thoughts and what is your pushback, and where do we go from here?
Good question. I'll be honest. I think it's ridiculous. It's awful. And just the other day, I was blessed. I was board to be on the board of directors for the Council of Social Studies in North Carolina, and that's a big honor and privilege. There's only three in the whole state, and so it meant a lot to me. Also, when it comes to history, I think it's ridiculous where they're trying to censor things and books or whatever, and just what needs to be taught. Because what I tell my students, if it happened, it happened, good and bad. And so what I try to do when I teach history, I let them know the good in our country. We were a country founded on one to be free, a democratic government, a republic. We have a good government. However, you have to be naive to look at the other things, because when you look at the Constitution, when you look at the Supreme Court cases in history, you see racism. So, in other words, if you tell the whole story, I don't have to say systemic, because if I look at the Constitution, look at three-fifths compromise, where blacks consider three-fifths of a person. You look at the several first presidents of the United States, they did own slaves. Everyone now knows Thomas Jefferson had children from Sally Hemings. Years ago, you couldn't even say Thomas Jefferson had children from a slave. Couldn't even say that, it was taboo. So when you bring history as it is, you're letting the students know. I'm not saying, oh, it's systemic, but I'm giving the facts. Uh, I went over Plessy versus Ferguson, and how basically Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896, it legitimized, justified, separate equal, which was racist. We also brought up Tame in my class the other day, Lum versus Rice in 1927, where a Chinese American person wanted to go to a white school, and they were rejected. We talked about the case Korematsu in the U.S., 1944. I did a podcast on that before, where President FDR had Executive Order 9066, which said that Asian Americans were forced to go into concentration camps, or internment camps, they called it, throughout the West Coast. When they got back after World War II, their homes were destroyed. And so Korematsu went to the Supreme Court and said it's not fair. He lost the case. So in other words, we see Supreme Court cases, we see constitutional rules, amendments, and clauses which show the obvious racism, that it was set in law. And can look at the de facto segregation in the South. And the word systemic, you can say or not. But if you look at how it was in Jim Crow South, North Carolina, everything was segregated. In Mississippi, the graveyards were segregated. Every public facility was segregated. And then one of the things which most people like to talk about, when we look at Nazi Germany, when it came to rise in 1933 with Adolf Hitler, the Nuremberg Laws in 1935, where did he get the ideas from mostly? Jim Crow South.
That's
Where
absolutely
did South,
correct.
yep. Where did South Africa get their apartheid from? Jim Crow South.
Yes.
Now Hitler made
Yes.
it to a higher level, but they was like, oh wow, separate bathroom, separate facilities, separate this, call them subhuman.
Yep.
That's what we saw. So we can't act like it didn't happen. And so when you see people trying to say it should not be taught, my thing is teach as it was. Yet now, because one of the things people think, if you teach about racism in the country, they think you're anti-American, not patriotic, you're against the government. To me, it's the opposite. It's nonsense. When you can show that you care so much about your country with the good, but also things that concern it, you're showing you care about the country because you're showing that those things that were wrong needed to be, you know, justified or atoned for. You look at Nazi Germany and how it was 1930s. Later on, the people said 20, 30 years later, like, wow, we were bad. No, because for years they tried to deny it. But after a while, no. After a while they tried to deny the Holocaust. Then they said, oh, it was only a prison camp. Oh, it was not that bad. Oh, we didn't have children. And then, research shows kids young as 9 were killed in the concentration camps, gassed, handicapped people, people with disabilities, Roma, Russians, homosexuals, you name it, all were put in concentration camps. So after a while, Germany had to look at the mirror and say, you know what, we did it, we messed up. We need to at least atone for it. And for the most part, they have. What America has to do with some things that occur is admit what happened and show that they were wrong. Show, okay, yes, slavery was wrong. Our economy in the South was dictated by free labor from slaves. I mean, look, slaves built the White House. A lot of people know that slaves built the White House. So then you look at the history of slavery, even after 1865, then the Reconstruction. Then after Reconstruction ends with the Rutherford B. Hayes and Tilden election, then not just the Klan, but then white supremacy rules the South. There were lynchings, there were race riots. And we look, then we scroll down all the way to World War One. In World War One, Woodrow Wilson president. We win World War One. Soldiers come back, they're lynched, they're killed. Rosewood, Florida, Elaine, Arkansas, Wilmington, North Carolina, race riots all over.
Atlanta, Georgia.
Atlanta, Georgia as well. And we can name city after city. We can name Birmingham. We can name all of it. And so the point was that it happened. And if you recognize, you just can't try to hide it from people that it didn't happen. You know, after a while, you know, the Germans try to hide the bodies. They try to hide the crematories. After a while, when the Allies came, they couldn't hide it. They couldn't hide the crematories. They couldn't hide the gas chambers. They couldn't hide the Zyklon B. They couldn't hide all of it. After a while, we cannot hide the evidence that there were plantations, that there were lynchings, that there were killings. And here we were supposed to be a democratic country, but we had segregated army until 1946. We're fighting Nazism in 1940, and we got segregated army. So when you look at what actually happened, you're showing the facts. You're not lying about it, but what you are showing was that, yes, this is a good country, but there were things we did that was not always the best decision. Putting Asian American in internment camps was not the best decision. Allowing blatant racism to exist without repercussions. Allowing lynching to be not illegal, so it's legal. And we had three congressmen vote against making lynching a law.
Right.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah.
A 100 years later, if you miss the news, 100 years later, thousands of lynchings later, now lynching is a federal crime, which
About
is a good
time.
thing. But how many ancestors had to die for it to happen?
Exactly. And the stories that you don't hear about, the lynchings you don't hear about. Also, when we think about this, the racism, what about the fact not only were we disenfranchised, but what about the things where, like, for example, African American males couldn't get homes in certain areas? I'm from New York, in Queens, and was raised Long Island. There was a town, Levittown. Levittown was a city built after World War II for veterans, but it said on the charter, on the contract, no blacks allowed. And in 1984, my dad was a veteran. He wanted to buy a house in Long Island, New York. They said, no, you can't buy a house in Levittown. You can't buy a house here. You can't buy a house here. Maybe Freeport and Roosevelt, yeah. But these are also the facets of the racism. In other words, okay, you can't live where you want to live. Gentrification. You can't go to the school system. You can't be a part of this town, this jurisdiction. You can't get this type of job. You know, even let's look at the numbers. 2% of educators are black male. Why is it only 2%? And there's a stigma, and you already know this. The stigma is that, okay, if you're black and you're a teacher, oh, you're just a coach. Does this teacher know? Does he really know history? Does he really know science? Does he really
Right.
know
It's
chemistry?
qualified
It's,
for the classroom.
yeah.
Yes, sir.
And being African American and teaching history, and I teach the AP courses like government and U.S. history. Sometimes it's a shock, like, okay, this guy's teaching American history, because the assumption is, oh yeah, yeah, you know, you're gonna know Black history, you're gonna know Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, you're
Yeah.
gonna know about Rosa Parks,
Yeah, but can he do AP? Right. And
right?
this is number one. I would definitely want to say what you're saying, Dr. Bond, is important because understanding and teaching critical race theory in the classroom is much needed. You have to teach the foundation of CRT is that how what role does race play in public policy and law, and to understand the impact of Plessy v. Ferguson or the Civil Rights Act or this legislation and these court cases that happened between the 19th and 20th century. You have to bring in C or T into the classroom. You have to
Yeah.
at least bring in the tenants, right?
Hmm.
And so, very quickly, as we end up, folks, it's already at the end of our YouTube episode, at least. What is, as you talk about this role of the black male educator, 1% of the educators in Georgia are black men, 2% nationally. What is some advice that you would give a young black male teacher like me or the next generation?
Here's what I'll tell them: get into the profession, especially if you have a heart for it, because it's still a wonderful profession. You may have to go through things, but what I'm saying is still go for it because not everybody can teach. And so if you've been blessed to teach, just do it. Sometimes it be discouraged to teach, but do it anyway because I said it's a great field. I've been doing it for 22 years. I still love it. And so despite what they may say, despite what the naysays may say, it's still a good profession. Deal with what you have to deal with. Don't get too down, but still love what you do because I know it's cliche, but it's not just you say, changing lives, but it's a profession that still holds weight. And the older you get, you get students who now they're about your age and they're like, yeah, Dr. Bond, yeah, I'm a teacher now, or I'm a coach, or I'm a lawyer, I'm a doctor. I was like, wow. And I'm like, yeah, I remember from 20 years ago. And they're about your age. They're like, yeah, I teach. I love it. I'm a history teacher. And the fact you can instill those things and the things we're teaching, if we could change one person's attitude
One.
about life, that's a blessing. If we could change one person's attitude about racism, because we may have had racist students in our classes before, and maybe it was our feedback or just being genuine that made them think, okay, let me look at this person colorblind, just accept it. I like this man as a teacher, I don't.
Yeah.
And so we as teachers have that power and influence to do that. And so I would tell any young person, get an education. It's still a wonderful profession.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, folks, that's our episode. We are so glad that you can join us tonight. We are reducing our time on our episodes. We'll be here every second Tuesday of the month for 30 minutes. However, we're trying to expand our reach across Instagram and other platforms. So I'm going to have Dr. Bond back on my Instagram, of course, very, very soon. We're going to have some students join us as well, and we're going to figure that out shortly. Join us again right here on our new home, Educational Entities, Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube next month on the 13th, April 13th, 6 p.m. Thank you, Dr. Baum. Thank you, family, and we'll see y'all next time.
Thank you as well. Thank you.